Welcome to Real Talk with Dr. Ruthie Uncensored.
I am Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons.
Where we get honest about the real challenges and possibilities in education and beyond.
Welcome to Keeping It Real with Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons Uncensored, where we dive into real issues in education and beyond and always bring real solutions. I'm your host, Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons. I'm also known as the Inclusive Disruptor, and today we're talking about a topic that should be central to every school and every school conversation, and that is representation. But I don't just want to talk about hanging up diverse posters or celebrating 1 month out of a year in terms of a cultural expression. We're going to dig into what representation really means and how it impacts student belonging, student voice, and identity in our schools. In this episode, I am introducing a framework that I call the 3 V's of representation, and that's visibility, voice, and validation. These 3 concepts helps us to reflect on who is seen, who is heard, and who feels valued in our schools today. Each of these V's actually deserve a deeper conversation. So I'm going to be unpacking them in upcoming episodes, but today we're going to zoom out and explore how they work together to create schools where all students can thrive as their full selves. If you're an educator, a leader, or a change maker within education or within organizations that have an impact on education, who's tired of surface level talk about improving outcomes, get ready for a real conversation about building schools where every student belongs. This episode is for you. So let's get into it. Why does this matter? This matters because when students, especially those who are historically pushed to the margins, aren't authentically represented, they're not able to meaningfully participate. That's not just a missed opportunity, it's actual harm. And so we have to have conversations around these things. But when schools actually center students' identities and their cultures, we open doors to real belonging and real access and real progress. This isn't about fairness alone. It really is about liberation through learning. Embedding representation into our daily practices is not extra work. It is really a part of the continuous improvement process. It is the work. That's how we build schools where every learner feels seen, heard, and ready to thrive. So let's take some time and get into some real talk. Representation is more than just about visibility. Although being able to see ourselves reflected in the learning community is important, it is about building environments that reflect, include, and respond to every learner. It's about honoring who they are, where they come from, and how they move through the world. At the core of this work, we have the 3 V's, right? Visibility, voice, and validation. These are not buzzwords, but these are tools that can be used to shift culture, policy, and practices. So let's dive into those 3 V's and give a high-level overview of what they are. The first V is visibility. And when we talk about visibility, we really are talking about who's seen, who's present in the curriculum, in the classrooms, and in leadership, right? And in celebrations, in collaboration. Who's a part of that? Who's seen there, right? How individuals and groups are seen, acknowledged, and considered across educational spaces really encompasses what we mean by visibility. And I want to give a couple of examples of that. So let's talk about a curriculum example in a U.S. history textbook, which might mention Rosa Parks, right, and Martin Luther King, but not Claudette Colvin, not Fannie Lou Hamer, or the Black Panthers. When our students don't see people like themselves in the content, we are saying to them that their stories don't matter. And we know that's not the intent of educators. We know that educators care about students. That's why we're here. That's why we choose this profession. Another example could be school spaces, where a high school proudly displays murals of past white principals and sport trophies, but no student art or multilingual signage, no acknowledgement of indigenous lands or cultural celebrations, no visibility of people with disabilities. Visibility shows students that we thought about them before they actually got to the school. And so we want to think about that. And there's some questions that we can ask when we're thinking about this concept of visibility. Who is visible in our classrooms and in leadership roles? Who's reflected in the content? Who's visible in meetings where decisions are made about practices and policy? Who's visible in everyday teaching and learning and the examples that are provided and the resources that are leveraged? And so we want to think about that. And these are just a few examples. When we think about voice, voice really is about asking whose ideas and experiences influence decisions and practices. We're talking about how schools intentionally ensure that all school community members, especially diverse students, families, and staff, have meaningful opportunities to speak, share, and influence the systems that they're navigating, but also the outcomes. So, what would be an example? A classroom example could be a teacher designing every assignment and discussion prompt where students complete them but rarely ask questions or challenge ideas. Now, let's compare that to a classroom where students co-create project topics based on issues that they care about, like housing insecurity or racial justice or climate change. When students are only allowed to echo and not initiate, that is not voice, that's actually performance. Another example, a school hosts a student voice event once a year, but in another school, students sit on interview panels, they help co-create school improvement plans, and they participate in teacher professional development as thought partners. In this particular case, student voice isn't an event, it's a structure and it's a way of life, it's a way of practice and habit within the school community. So some questions that we can ask around that would be, whose voices are centered in decision-making and curriculum? And who is present and who is missing? Whose perspectives are prioritized when policies are created or revised? And how do we ensure students and families feel heard and valued? These are really important questions for us to constantly ponder. We also want to ask questions such as what structures actually exist to amplify marginalized voices. We want to make sure that we're including students at every level of design with regards to school and decision making, all the way from the classroom where the curriculum is being negotiated by students and teachers to the policies that are created or revised or enacted. The third V is validation. And when we talk about validation, we're really talking about how are students' identities and lived experiences affirmed? How are they respected? How are they celebrated? How are they centered? And when we talk about this, we really are talking about how school environments affirm students' identities, cultural backgrounds, lived experiences, and contributions. And in this moment, I do want to draw from Calabrese, Barton, and Tan's framework of rightful presence, because this has to be about rightful presence. It's about making sure the structures are set up in ways that validate students. In order to do that, we have to dig into the ideas of rightful presence. Rightful presence is ensuring that marginalized students are not just allowed in the room or space, but that they are seen, they're heard, and they're valued, and they're able to take shape of the room itself. It is about moving from access and representation to agency, co-design, and justice. So validation is the affirmation of identity and experience, and rightful presence is the transformation of systems to make that affirmation structurally meaningful. And together, they call educators to remake schools not just as inclusive spaces, but as equitable, identity-affirming, and justice-oriented environments. An example would be a classroom where Black students are routinely disciplined for talking too loud, while white peers are praised for being assertive. Students raise concern about double standards in the classroom, and in response, the teacher co-facilitated a class discussion about cultural communication norms, bias, and participation expectations. What comes out of that are the class co-developed new engagement norms that actually affirm diverse ways of expressing ideas. Validation is not just recognizing difference, it's building learning environments where students co-author the norms that affirm who they are. Let's talk about a school policy example, because we just did a classroom example. So a school policy example could be a district with a rigid dress code that punishes Black girls for unprofessional hairstyles. And if you have been watching the news over the last few years, we've seen Black and brown girls and boys be disciplined for their hairstyles, pushed out of school for their hairstyles, ridiculed, and microaggressed for their hairstyles. So let's talk about the school policy example, where the district has a rigid dress code and punishes Black girls for unprofessional hairstyles. And I'm going to put my hand in air quote for that. These are unprofessional hairstyles, right? Meanwhile, another district revises their policy to explicitly affirm cultural expressions, including natural hair and head wraps. I have micro locks, and it is a natural hairstyle. I'm very proud of it. When we talk about professional hairstyles, we need to think about how are we defining the word professional? Who defined the word professional? What is the context around that? Who does it unintentionally or intentionally exclude? Who does it center? And how does that either create spaces of belonging and inclusion, or how does it create hostile environments or environments where students feel like they don't belong, where they're not validated through the structures that have been put in place? Validation is not about someone having power, maintaining that power, and inviting someone in, because we know when we think about rightful presence, we don't want to extend an invitation because invitations can be removed. We can uninvite someone when we invite them. But when we talk about the idea of rightful presence, it's this idea that you belong here just as much as anyone else, just as much as me or anyone else. So what does this look like on the ground? Whether you're a teacher or a school leader or district decision maker, here are some real ways to embed visibility, voice, and validation in your daily work. And I'm going to talk about these solutions and give a couple of examples, but remember, I'm going to follow up and provide an episode on each of these so that we can break them down more and invite guests on the show to talk about the K-12 system in terms of what visibility, voice, and validation felt like for them as they navigated their experiences. We're going to start talking about visibility, voice, and validation from the classroom teacher lens. And I want to start by saying validation is ensuring that educational experiences are culturally relevant. When we talk about validation through the lens of rightful presence, it's actually sharing institutional power with students to transform school culture. And I draw from not only Calabresi, Barton, and Tan, but also from Geneva Gay and from Banks and from Paris and Aleem in terms of their culturally responsive and sustaining frameworks and culturally relevant instruction and multicultural education. So what would be some practices related to teachers in the school community? One would be making sure that they are displaying student work, right? If you are a teacher, are you displaying student work? Are you displaying in your classroom multilingual signage? Are you including culturally inclusive texts that represent all identities and histories? Are you including opportunities for yourself to reflect on whose histories and perspectives and voices are centered or absent? These become really important. Are you integrating a broad range of cultural narratives and knowledge systems into the curriculum? Are you combining direct instruction with inquiry-based learning to allow for students to be in charge of their learning while also providing them with the necessary skills and instruction to support building their knowledge base as they're also leveraging their own knowledge that they bring into the spaces to focus on learning and topics and subjects that they are excited about and that they're interested in within the curriculum for your school and for your district? And I wanted to give an example of how I did that as a classroom teacher. See, when I was a student, I didn't see myself reflected in the books that I read. The content areas didn't reflect me. It wasn't until I was in the latter part of high school that my history teacher started talking about the contributions of Black people as teaching American history so seamlessly, so effortlessly, that it had me on the edge of my seat every day. My mom did buy me a book called The Snowy Day by Jack Ezra Keith, and I loved that book. I would read that book over and over again and just imagine playing in the snow. But seeing a little boy who looked like me in the literature definitely drew me into the story, and I could relate to the story that was being told. Because I didn't see myself reflected in the literature and in teaching and learning in school on a regular basis, maybe once a year during Black History Month, that had an impact on me in such a way that I wanted to know, going into teaching, how could I ensure that all of my students saw themselves reflected in teaching and learning and in the books that I actually put in the classrooms? I can tell you, I had literature around the room on the bases of the chalkboards, on the bookshelves, in every nook and cranny that represented multiple perspectives and lived experiences and multicultural in its nature. As students came into the classroom, I tried to find literature that reflected their lived experiences. And I'm going to tell you that even though I did that, I had opportunities to grow and learn. But as a teacher, that's what I wanted to do. So I put books in the classroom. I made sure that students played a role. In my first few years, I used to decorate the room and put everything up. And then as I grew into this profession, I learned that it was important to actually leave space for students to co-design the room with me. And so as I got more into my teaching, I put certain things up that would outline some of the themes for learning, but then leave space for students to come in and co-design the room. I wanted it to be a welcoming space that they wanted to come into. So I wanted to get things started, but I also understood that they needed to see themselves reflected in the design in the room itself. Okay, let's talk about voice for teachers. When we talk about voice for teachers, when I dig into the podcast episode on voice, I'm going to dig into Toshalis and Nakula's framework around the voice continuum, because they do a really good job of helping us to understand through their framework that it's not enough to ask students for their opinion. They have to be co-designers. They have to be at the table, at every level of education, engaging in conversations and design so that the school systems and the experiences that they navigate reflect their input and their lived experiences. And so in all of the professional learning that I provide to school districts, to school leadership teams, to departments of education and other educational agencies, I often draw from Toshalis and Nakula's framework because I feel like it helps us to think about student voice on a whole nother level. So we're going to dig more into that more deeply in that episode that's going to come up. But for right now, when we talk about voice in the classroom, we're talking about creating opportunities for students to co-plan lessons, to lead discussions, and behavioral expectations. Also, we want to make sure that we're providing opportunities to facilitate student-led inquiry, grounded in their lived experiences and aligned to the district curriculum and scope and sequence. We're not saying abandon the curriculum, but we're saying how do we enhance the curriculum by engaging students in the opportunity to question why and to dig and do research to answer those questions, to do the same thing that we ask them to do in science, but to have them do that in integrated experiences across literacy, social studies, science, mathematics, and other content areas. We're not asking students to guess when we do this. We're asking students to become critical thinkers. We want them to think and question and move beyond surface possibilities and resist this idea of spoon feeding, because spoon feeding does not create meaningful connections and learning. And so we want to make sure that we're leveraging their funds of knowledge when they come into the classroom. I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we can think about when we're doing this, right? And by doing that, I'm going to share some of my own examples in terms of how I engaged in voice as a classroom teacher. Early in my career, I learned that it was helpful for students to create pledges. And I learned that from my students. Every year, we would work together and they would develop the class pledge. They would talk about who they were in that educational space, what they were going to do and be in that space, and who we would be collectively. And even though I'm saying them, I was a part of that, but I wanted to decenter myself from describing it because truly their words created the pledge and we said it every day. I think that the only thing that I added to the pledge was that they were wonderfully and fearfully made. And so every day they would start that pledge by saying that they were important people, that they were wonderfully and fearfully made. And then they would go on to talk about how they would navigate their school day and what values they would hold true to in the classroom. I also centered students' voice in the ways in which I designed my language arts units. I would design integrated literacy units, and I would look to see what types of behaviors or patterns was I seeing that would speak to the students' lived experiences in the school. And there was one situation where students were having a lot of conflict on the playground, which would then make it kind of difficult to get back in the classroom and get right back to learning because we had to sort out the conflict. And so as I was designing my next unit, I thought, I really want to design a unit around conflict resolution. And I want to use student literature. I want to use literature that reflects children, the ages of my students. I was teaching third grade with this particular unit, and the unit was called Conflict Resolution. I had a whole handful of literature, and I thought I was going to teach my students something. right? And so all the books had different children, characters, solving conflicts so that students can begin to see themselves as able to resolve conflicts. I was reading one book called Your Move, and it was a book about the influence of a group of children on a child and then that child's influence on their younger sibling. And in this book, the older brother was challenged by a group of kids to climb a highway sign and tag it. And so I had questions, inquiry questions around this particular unit. And one of the questions was around, would you make a choice even if you knew it might harm you? I can't remember it exactly, but I was trying to, in some ways, force the students to acknowledge that they should not always do what they are influenced to do if it might cause harm to them or someone else. And one of my students raised his hand and he said, my name was Mrs. Riddle at the time, Mrs. Riddle, but what if? And so in that moment, he shared that his uncle was being initiated into a gang similar to the bigger brother in his story. And he did not do what they asked him to do because he knew that it would bring harm. And he was harmed as a result of that. He was harmed in a violent way. And in that moment, I'm sitting there as a classroom teacher thinking, what do I do with this? Now, I could have just pushed it away, but that was a student drawing from his funds of knowledge, challenging the paradigm that I had set around it being really kind of simple. It wasn't simple, what I was asking them in that inquiry question. It was actually a complex question. And I wanted them to be critical thinkers, but I was pushing them to answer questions in ways that were not so critical in that moment. But because I really valued my students and their voices, in that moment, I said to my student, thank you so much for sharing your story. And you're helping us to understand that it's not so simple. That even though in this story, I'm pushing for you all to understand that we shouldn't do things that might bring harm to us, that it's not just as simple as that. It's not that simple, that sometimes we have to look at the whole story. And I'm sorry about what happened to your family member. And it took us into a rich conversation around the complexity of conflict resolution and what might be some strategies to use. I always communicated with my parents about what was being taught and made sure that my principal saw my materials that I developed to align with the scope and sequence. And so there were no surprises to my parents or to my principal about what was happening in the classroom, because sometimes in teaching and learning, when you're really authentically engaging students in teaching and learning, you can have a situation where something comes up that if your principal or your parents aren't aware of what the curriculum is and what the teaching and learning materials are, that could be unsettling. So it made it a lot easier to invite parents into the classroom and share the resources. I would always send home weekly communication, what we were going to be teaching and learning about. And then if there are any questions, to let me know. I also always had multiple adults in the classroom. I had my amazing colleague, Dr. James D'Amico, in my classroom for the first 3 years of my early teaching. But I also had an open door classroom and invited parents to be in the classroom. They were co-facilitators of learning and it supported every student. On any given day, I had probably around 3 to 5 adults in the classroom, and they were effective in how they supported me and the students when they were there. And so that's an important thing to think about and remember as well. Again, when we break down voice and talk about it in an upcoming episode, I'm going to dig into the voice continuum framework and talk more about that. But that was a critical moment. I'll also share in the upcoming video how I continue to improve my ability to center students' voices on that continuum and opportunities that I still had to grow in an upcoming episode. But I want to move to validation. For teachers, validation really is around co-designing curriculum with students and drawing from their home cultures, their community knowledge, and critical social perspectives, being able to read the room and draw from students' funds of knowledge to bring them in. So co-designing is optimum, and including students and influencing what you're going to teach and how you're going to teach it, it really becomes important, and there are ways to do that. And then also, when we talk about validation in the classroom, rather than viewing resistance from students as disruption, we should treat it as a critical insight into, are there any norms or ways of relating that might be unjust, that may be unfair, that may be harmful? And then invite students to collaboratively identify, critique, and redesign aspects of the classroom experience. You can create a questionnaire, and there are several out there that you give students, and it can be short, that ask them to give feedback. We're living in a world of feedback. Anytime I do anything online or work with any company, right away they will push back quick feedback. If I get my car serviced, if I'm on a flight, if I'm on a vacation, if I do have someone come in and do some home improvement in the home, I'm often given the opportunity to give my feedback, which allows for me to influence, hopefully, the way that they're doing business. We should be doing that in schools as well, in the classroom and also at the building level, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We want to make sure we establish class structures like advisory councils or student facilitated discussions that position students as partners in shaping learning environments. I worked with a school system here in Michigan where they did restorative circles. And in my building as a principal, teachers did morning meetings. I'm probably getting the name wrong, where every day they were able to hear from all of their students and let that shape and influence how the day would unfold. And so there are different ways to do this. And I just want to let you know, one way that I did this was when I was teaching, and around the time that I was maybe about a few years into teaching, September 11th took place. And just want to be thoughtful that this is sensitive, just kind of giving a trigger acknowledgement that this could be triggering for some. And so my apologies for that. But I want to talk about what happened in the classroom as a result of that. It was a devastating moment in our society. And at the same time, as days passed, I noticed that my Lebanese student began to be teased and treated differently because of what had happened. And so I remember one night I thought, I've got to do something to address this. We were engaging in part of our curriculum where we were focusing on celebrating differences, and we focused on Lebanon. When the students came to school the next day, I had already started redesigning the room to reflect my Lebanese students' culture. And then because I didn't know enough about his culture, I invited him and his family to be a part of continuing to design the room. And you should have seen him. He went from the internalizing feeling the rejection he was getting from the students and probably from society at large, to being so excited and so engaged in the process that he was cutting out different designs and putting them up, working with other students. My behavior influenced the students' behavior. Teachers, we have a lot of power, so we want to be thoughtful about that. My actual behavior influenced the other students' behaviors. I brought in literature on Lebanon and asked my students' parents to come in and share about their culture, their values. We did a lot of learning about this particular student's culture, about the Lebanese culture. And then we had a celebration. And in that celebration, there was a lot of teaching and learning, but also opportunities to experience the culture in the classroom. Now, Dr. James Banks talks about levels of multicultural education. This was not just about bringing in food and tasting it. Although that was a part of it, it was really about centering the Lebanese culture and having students, through learning experiences, began to understand how connected we were. We were looking at how what we were learning about the Lebanese culture was very similar in different ways in terms of values and relationships to other cultures in the classroom. And before we knew it, he was the star of the classroom. I will never forget the joy that I could see on him navigating the classroom. It changed the interactions that he was experiencing in a really profound way. And so that also impacted me, because a part of keeping it real is not just talking about what we need to do in education, but also sharing ways in which I was challenged to grow. During that time, I had a lot of fear because of what happened during 9/11, and his parents invited me over for dinner. They were so supportive of the education process, and they supported me every step of the way. And I'll never forget when I got the invitation. I was so honored. I was very humbled, but I also subconsciously had a fear of going to their home. And part of it was because I had an implicit bias that I had picked up that I didn't know about. I had a conversation at home about that fear and made a decision I was going to lean into going to spend time with the family. So I went to their home for dinner. They were welcoming and inviting. Dinner was delicious. And we talked about education in their home country. And so that was growth for all of us. And there was a level of validation there. And we'll talk more deeply about that later. I also had missteps when it comes to validation as a classroom teacher. I remember telling one of my students, you can talk like that at home, but you can't talk like that here. And that's what I heard, right? I was pounded into my head, speak proper English. I came to learn later that my Black vernacular is a linguistically sound language, and that when we tell students they can't talk the way they talk at home, that is a form of erasure and cultural invalidation. And so when we talk about representation in terms of validation, we want to make sure we're not asking students to check their identities at the door, because we certainly aren't checking ours at the door. And if we're being made to feel like we have to check our identities at the door, we have to make sure we speak truth to power. If you want to know more about that, watch episode 1. I'm going to talk about what visibility might look like for a building principal. We want to make sure that we are asking questions such as, who is present and who's absent from different celebrations that are going on. And one of my examples would be when I was a building principal and a curriculum director across 2 different districts, the top 10 kids and the students who were accessing gifted and talented programming, they all looked the same. They were majority white students, and you would usually have 1 or 2 Asian American students present. And you rarely, if ever, had Black students or Latinx students. I had to question that. Why is that happening? Are we saying that students who are part of those communities and identities aren't smart enough to access gifted and talented and AP experiences, that they're not the top 10? And are we comfortable with letting this continue to happen? As a new principal going into my building, I remember walking into the music room and all these little figurines of Beethoven and different white classical musicians, and not seeing any females represented, any people with disabilities represented, any people of color represented. And so I had to have a conversation with my amazing music teacher to ask her to not figurines, but posters. My apologies, there were posters. If she could consider, and we had a conversation, she just come in and say, you need to remove these or you need to change these. I asked her to think about who was reflected and who was missing. I asked her to think about what it might feel like for a student who did not look like the individuals on the walls. And she engaged in a deep conversation with me and went on to begin to put other individuals on the walls that reflected the diversity of the school community. I also saw that in our library, where when we went into the library, there were figures of all of the presidents. And we all know until Barack Obama, visually or perceivably, all of the presidents were white and all male, right? And so my conversation with the media specialist was, when you look around the room and you see these, what do you see? What does that tell you? What's missing? What does that mean? How might a student feel? How might a female feel? How might a person with a disability feel? And so after having those conversations, she made the decision to diversify the figurines and the different ways that she designed the media space so that when students came into the space, they could see themselves represented. And I'm not even going to get into how we started thinking about, towards the latter part of my tenure as a principal, what books do we have on the shelves? What books are dated that would be full of microaggressions or harm or deficit frameworks or ideology? And how do we begin to go through and evaluate all of our books? And we started that journey to remove books that were dated, books that were harmful, and to replenish, through the support of an amazing parent council, books that would reflect the diversity of the school community. Okay, so those are some examples as building principal. Let's talk about voice as a principal. When we talk about voice as a principal, we want to talk about making sure that we support formal student leadership groups, right? And we want to make sure, as an example, that they have decision-making power around discipline and school improvement. We want to examine whose voices are centered in decision-making, and we want to be able to design committees and school leadership structures that include diverse students and families, so that the schools are designed in ways that sets all students up for success. I want to give an example of how this played out for me as a building principal. I remember when we were implementing positive behavior supports, we were actually implementing multi-tiered systems of support, the integrated model. And a part of that was implementing PBIS and also really looking deeply at our literacy practices and building teachers' capacity to teach reading in ways that would ensure that all students were learning to read, and then also making sure that we embedded into that process culturally responsive practices in literature so that students could see themselves reflected in teaching and learning. As we were implementing PBIS, positive behavior supports, we were looking at data on a regular basis. Every month we were looking at data, and we were looking at data even more frequently to understand how to support students who needed additional support. But we were also looking at data monthly so we could continue to address our school environment, because data should be about addressing the school environments. It should not be about fixing the student. It should not be about fixing the teacher. It should not be about finding fault and problems with families, but it should be about how can we design or redesign the school with students in mind. All right, so we looked at our data and we saw that we were having a lot of issues at lunch recess, right, across each of the lunch recesses. I think we had 2 or 3 of them. And so when we drilled down to understand what was happening and what the implications were, we found that we had a lot of students that were having some different issues outside. So we addressed that. But we also realized that we needed to do something structurally to decrease the amount of time students were in the office or teachers were having to de-escalate different emotions from situations that were happening during recess. We decided that we wanted to do this test run of having our students go outside first and then come in and eat. So we reversed it. And we also did that because we realized students were throwing away a lot of their food and rushing to eat to go outside for recess. And so we also wanted to make sure that students were getting their nutrients and that we could address issues before students came back in so that they could actually get back to class ready to learn. And it really had a profound impact on our office referrals, on the amount of minutes we gain in terms of teaching and learning, and also the amount of food students actually were eating so that they wouldn't rush out. They were throwing full lunches out because they were trying to get outside to play. And that changed. I'm not even getting into all the different strategies that we implemented, because the point of this is that there were students who were not happy with that change. We never asked the students for their thoughts about it. We just implemented it. Again, I was learning as well, right? And so while we were doing what we thought was best for students, we didn't ask students for their thoughts. A parent let me know that the students wanted to meet with me, the parent of the student who started the petition. So now I was a person who came up in the era of children should be seen and not heard. That was a common phrase in my family. You should be seen and not heard. Of course, anyone who knows me knows that's impossible. If you see me, you're going to hear me. Part of my gift is the gift of talking. And initially, I was kind of like, I'm not going to sit down and have a conversation with a child about a decision that we made as adults with expertise. But then I realized that if I am talking about culturally responsive practices, that I have to make sure I'm being responsive to the culture of the students who have this sense of empowerment to be able to come and say, I am not happy with a decision that you made and I want to talk about it. So we had a roundtable discussion in the office, and the students who led the petition and their parents came to the table, and we had a conversation about how the students felt. And what was really interesting was hearing their feelings helped me to understand that it would have been really helpful to actually have a conversation with our students, just like we did when we implemented PBIS. If we had done something similar to that, we would have gotten insight on how to do it, and students wouldn't have been caught off guard because they would have had an opportunity to share their feelings about it and provide feedback or thought partnership on what that could look like. I did share with the students why we did it, what was going on, and also shared with the parent what was going on and why. And we did share often the decisions we were making with our parent council. It got better after this experience. I began to realize I need to make sure not only am I taking data to the parent council and sharing with them what we're doing and what the outcomes are, but also here's what we're thinking, and we'd like you to be a part of how we should go about implementing this. What should we be doing? And the parent council played a huge role in a lot of the decision-making that was taking place. We were bringing them more into the continuous improvement process. After I shared with them that this was not at the time I was still Mrs. Riddle, it wasn't a Mrs. Riddle decision, but it was a staff decision based on data and based on practices that we've been observing and problems that we wanted to address. After sharing that, the parents were very supportive. They definitely wanted kids to be eating all of their food, as much of it as possible. They definitely wanted students to be able to come back and get back to learning. They definitely wanted to see a decrease in physical contact and aggression at lunchtime during recess. And the students, even though I think the students who did this were maybe in 3rd or 4th grade, they also appreciated me taking time to hear their concerns, their frustrations, and they actually felt like it was a good decision. And we were able to continue with that process, but we promised we would revisit that and get feedback and make sure that it was what it needed to be for everyone involved. And again, I didn't know anything about the student voice continuum at that time, but I was starting to touch on that. And it was through my response to students saying, hey, this is a problem for us. What are we going to do about it? Finally, for principals, let's talk about validation. Validation is about ensuring cultural relevance. And when we think about it through the lens of rightful presence, it's about sharing institutional power with students to transform school culture. And in many ways, when the students came to the table, that was an opportunity for me to think about how am I reauthorizing rights, even though I'm the adult and I'm bringing experience, that student and their family members are bringing experience as well. And they have the right to be there and they have a right to design the experience and the environment and the structure in ways that benefits them as well. And so we want to be thoughtful about that. As district administrators, when we talk about visibility, we really want to talk about making sure that we're using district-wide visuals and communications to celebrate diverse cultures, language, and identities. We want to make sure we are assessing regularly who is represented in school policies, staffing, and programming. We want to make sure we're looking at who's visible in gifted and talented programming and advanced placement courses and who is absent. We want to see who is represented in discipline and exclusionary practices and who is not. As a district administrator, with regards to visibility, one of the examples I can share is engaging in core adoptions of school materials and looking through them with other districts at a regional level to save on the purchasing and to be on the same page regionally. We came together often around these core adoptions and engaged in collective learning and decision making. And one of the things I remembered was looking at the math materials. We didn't see people with disabilities, we didn't see women, we didn't see girls, we didn't see people of color. We didn't see that reflected visibly in the materials. And so my conversation with the vendors, a bit of feedback is that you need to be revising this content, these resources, to make sure that they reflect diversity, because our children are looking at these. They need to see themselves reflected. And remembering hearing one of the vendors say that we really take that to heart and we'll take that feedback and make sure we do something about it, and hearing others blow it off. And suffice it to say, we went with the vendor who was open to receiving that feedback and also bringing additional materials for us to see the diversity reflected. There's a long ways to go for vendors, but I believe that they're on the journey. And that is something I also offer in my services through RPS Educational Impact, is to review curriculum materials and resources, whether it's at a classroom level, district level, building level, also if it's at a vendor level, to be a consultant to help make sure that diversity is reflected in the resources in ways that is validating and asset for students. All right. With regards to voice at the district level, we're going to borrow again from Chalice and Akula's framework on voice continuum for students in a subsequent podcast. But for this particular episode, we want to make sure as district level administrators that we're institutionalizing student participation in district level planning and policy. I have worked with districts where they brought their students in and engaged in collective professional development to review and change policies in their districts to make sure that those policies were reflected of the lived experiences of the school, of the students in the school community, and that they did not do harm. They were part of school committees. Some of the partners that I supported also began to have students be a part of their board. They couldn't be on the board, but be committees to the board to engage in looking at data and having conversations to reflect all the voices in their district around what was working and what needed attention. The board engaged with them very deeply and made decisions that would change policies to support students. So this work is being done and can be done. With regards to validation, making sure that at the district level that you're adopting policies that promote culturally sustaining pedagogical practices, such as making sure we're including heritage language programs, that our curriculum is anti-racist, and that it's inclusive, making sure that discipline systems are developed in partnership with students and families and community leaders. Also investing in capacity building for staff to understand power, positionality, and historical harm so that they can better support the co-creation of systems with communities, and also creating accountability structures through participatory action research, through panels, through equity audits that position young people as drivers of continuous improvement. That's really important. And again, drawing from Calabresi, Barton, and Tan's Rightful Presence framework, I want you to remember that this work is about centering the voices of students and those who have been historically excluded from decision-making and reauthorizing rights. All right, so enough about that for right now. Let's get into some food for thought. Real representation challenges us to look beyond the surface, as you can see from those examples. And we have to ask, are we disrupting long-standing systems that have marginalized students and limited their opportunities? Are we creating spaces where multiple perspectives are not just present, but truly valued? I'm drawing from Paris and Alim's work from 2014, and also from Mulligan and Kozlowski's work from 2009. But let's keep the conversation going. I want you to share your thoughts. How are you embedding authentic representation in your work? What are the wins and challenges that you are experiencing? And I want you to keep the conversation going by either joining Facebook or on LinkedIn or my YouTube channel. I also put out a monthly newsletter. So if you subscribe to that newsletter, you will have access to the conversations. I also developed a resource. It's a companion guide that allows for you to understand more deeply how representation is happening within your classroom or your school building or in your district. You can do a self-assessment that allows for you to assess to what degree is representation, those 3 V's, centered and situated within your educational environments. And then you can also get into some action planning. Please join the conversation as we continue to keep it real about real issues in education that need real solutions with real people. So I hope that this has been meaningful for you. Like I said, in subsequent episodes, I'm going to be bringing in some very special guests who will help us talk more deeply about each of the 3 V's. We want to make sure that we are deeply embedding into our practices and our mindsets, visibility, voice, and validation. When I unpack these more deeply, I'm going to bring in some frameworks that will help us look at it in a more deep and profound way that will give you some tools and strategies to be able to engage in increasing representation in ways that build positive sense of self for students, positive identities and intersecting identities for students, and also for the adults that are engaging in this work. I know that you are working hard to make a difference for all of your students, and so know that I have a profound amount of appreciation and respect for you as educators. And I want you to know, until the next episode, remember to keep it real. Thank you so much for joining Real Talk with Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons Uncensored. I truly appreciate you taking time to listen. In addition to this podcast, I have a company called RPS Educational Impact, where I support school districts, educational entities, and other organizations who are wanting to improve their systems through continuous improvement processes, and also those who want to make sure that the systems are working for all students and for the school community. RPS Educational Impact is dedicated to empowering students, families, and educators. Our mission is to support educational agencies in developing innovative solutions that strengthen educational practices, policies that enrich learning experiences and support each student's success. We enjoy supporting educators at all levels through professional development, coaching, continuous improvement, and implementation supports to create learning environments where all students can thrive. So visit rpsimpact.com to find out more about the technical assistance that we can provide you upon request. Thank you.
Welcome to Real Talk with Dr. Ruthie Uncensored.
I am Dr. Ruthie Payno-Simmons.
Where we get honest about the real challenges and possibilities in education and beyond.